Oh hi, I'm the heretic. The truth about neoliberalism is that it doesn't exist. There, video over. Questions, comments, critique? Okay, I'll elaborate. It's a bold thesis statement to lead off with, but by the end of the video, you should see where I'm coming from and hopefully you'll agree. Starting out, we should clarify our definitions. Neoliberalism is an idea. However, unlike other ideas like libertarianism, happiness, the number 4, or the color purple, its definition falls into the category of anti-concept. What is an anti-concept? It's a term that comes from Randian objectivism to describe something with an irrational definition. For example, a squared circle, globalism, or Roderick Long's Zaxelbacks. Anti-concepts are added to discussions to obfuscate language and impede discourse. To clarify, something being obfuscating does not make it an anti-concept. The contradictory, irrational definition does. An anti-concept cannot exist in nature, nor can anything that could exist in the universe be described by them. As such, to identify neoliberalism as not existing, I need only prove that neoliberalism is an anti-concept. So before we can get into anything, we need to know what is attempting to be conveyed when saying neoliberalism. The term is associated with statist policy positions that increase the power and influence of privately owned economic firms over society at the cost of government influence. This manifests as support for government policy positions like austerity, crushing labor unions, privatization, deregulation, economic globalization, free trade, among others. The eagle-eyed among you may already notice a disconnect between their intent and their actions, as well as the false dichotomy between the private and public sector, but we'll go over that in a bit. For now, here's the history of neoliberalism. Friedrich Hayek and his friends started the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947, forming a think tank of intellectuals dedicated to understanding the principles of classical liberalism as a philosophy in advancing the study of market-oriented economic systems as well as freedom of expression. Among those in its first meeting are Friedrich Hayek, the Society's first president, Karl Popper, Ludwig von Mises, and Milton Friedman. Maybe you've heard of a few of them. The Society was created in response to the rising prominence of economic central planning in political economies around the world, not just in Soviet Russia, but also the technocrats of pre- and post-war America and Europe. Their goal, to create an effective and consistent demarcation between authoritarian collectivism and liberalism. This is said to be the foundation of the modern incarnation of neoliberalism. From there, members would go on to found other think tanks, such as the Mises Institute, the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, and the Foundation for Economic Education, among others. The expansion of neoliberal economic thought would spread out and grow before achieving political hegemony in the late 70s and the early 80s, with the rise of President Ronald Reagan, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of the UK, among other rulers gaining power in the West and in other places, buoying the rise in popularity and prominence of ideas critical to the technocratic Keynesian status quo of the post-war West, such as with the rise of the Chicago School of Economics. Since then, neoliberalism is claimed to have been dominant in the West, with political parties on all sides of the so-called political spectrum incorporating some variation of neoliberalism into their party platforms, their politicians implementing neoliberal policies. Since Reagan, every US president is claimed to have been a neoliberal of some kind. For example, Bill Clinton, and the cuts to welfare spending and the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement. George W. Bush's tax cuts for the rich, Medicare Part D, which was a giant subsidy to pharmaceutical companies. Obamacare was similarly a huge subsidy to the health insurance industry, and don't even get the proponents of the neoliberal narrative started on the various bailouts and stimulus packages, and that's even before we get to Donald Trump. All this to point out that neoliberalism is put forward as the, thing, inspiring the specific policy decisions of governments in the West, today, as to how they are going to use their monopoly on arbitration to victimize their tax cattle. Neoliberalism, put simply, is the status quo of today. The etymology of the term neoliberal is, predictably enough, the combining of the prefix of neo, meaning new, with liberal, implying a new, evolved form of liberalism differentiated from the liberalism of John Stuart Mill or John Locke. It was first coined by French economist Charles Guide, which I am almost certain I am mispronouncing, describing the beliefs of Italian neoclassical and then fascist economist Maffeo Pantaleoni in 1898. However, its first use to describe philosophy would appear before the Mont Pelerin Society was even an idea. In the 1930s, a German economist named Alexander Rousseau would create a middle ground philosophy between liberalism and communism. It was affirmed in 1938 in a meeting in Paris called the Colloque Walter Lippmann, between several prominent intellectuals, Mises and Hayek among them, though the two were not pleased with the outcome of the meeting. Yet this does not get us any closer to understanding neoliberalism. We are told that the Mont Pelerin Society is neoliberal. See? It even says so on Wikipedia. But that term is noticeably absent on the Society's own website. They repeatedly affirm their commitment to individualism, market economies, and government policy action in favor of property rights and markets under the guise of liberalism, even clarifying their definition of liberalism. Note, here, liberal is used in its European sense, broadly epitomized by a preference for minimal and dispersed government, rather than in its American sense, which indicates the opposite preference for an extension and concentration of government powers. Furthermore, their statement of aims denies intellectual hegemony and that no one member may speak for another. This is affirmed by founding member Hayek, being a social democrat, while the society is attended by consequentialist anarcho-capitalists like David Friedman. Whether or not the Mont Pelerin Society is being entirely truthful about their own organization on their website, I'll leave that up to you. But they do not describe themselves as neoliberal, and neither does anyone else accused of being a neoliberal. It's a label foisted upon them with little regard to their actual thoughts and opinions, often cherry-picking certain alleged neoliberals' positions as being evidence for their neoliberalism, even conflating means as ends unto themselves and using this to justify accusations of disregard for human rights in preference for markets. I can grant that at some point in history, some third positionists called themselves neoliberal to represent a preference for economic organization distinct from liberalism, communism, or fascism. When Rousseau conceived of the term, his idea was skeptical of both state and market power. According to Rousseau, the state would have market police enforcing parameters to maximize fair competition, ban advertising, implement a progressive corporate tax, as in taxes that would become more severe the larger and more prosperous the company is. Utility, railroad, and weapons industries would be monopolized by the state, as would any so-called natural monopoly industry, or arguing for government education that indoctrinated kids into his agrarian ideal. Rousseau apparently being a technological regressive. He was also a proponent of government-run unemployment insurance, government-run employment services, and government interventions into the market in times of crisis. Now, there are a lot of problems with this proposal, and I could make an entire video exploring Rousseau's ideas and everything wrong with them, how a utility is arbitrarily defined, how the idea of natural monopolies are entirely fictional, and the audacity he has to call himself skeptical of state power, given the infringement he demands on property rights that is only possible through an all-powerful authoritarian government. Suffice to say, in its embracing of state power and coercion, Rousseau's philosophy forfeits consistency or coherency. However, the point in bringing up these views is to contrast him with how neoliberalism is viewed today rather than criticize Rousseau. Remember what I described neoliberalism as earlier: austerity, deregulation, generally government policies that are commonly associated with reducing government involvement in the economy. Both modern neoliberalism and Rousseau's confused social democracy are forms of legal positivism, but one is very favorable towards government coercion and domination, while the other one, while still favorable towards it, has a pretense of state skepticism. Superficially, there is a difference in how aggressive the state they wish to build would be in victimizing their subjects' rights. One ostensibly desired to put boundaries on voluntary economic activity, while the other wished to remove said boundaries. However, which one is neoliberal? Well, the answer is both, and neither, plus one or the other. You see, there's a problem with how neoliberalism is defined. Bill Clinton and Margaret Thatcher are considered to be neoliberal. One was a rabid protectionist, while the other signed NAFTA, as mentioned earlier. Now, to be fair, NAFTA was not a free trade agreement, that should be clear, but as proponents of the neoliberalism narrative consider it to be so, it showcases just one example of said narrative contradicting itself in how neoliberals can simultaneously be for and against free trade. Another conflict is the neoclassical, Chicago, and Austrian economic schools, despite their conflicting ideas of mathematical economic modeling, central banking, value, business cycle theory, etc., are all lumped into the umbrella of neoliberal. Privatization, or deregulation, a cause regularly championed for by people who are claimed to be neoliberals, never results in the government actually ceasing its violations of natural law, or even just the modest reductions in government authority allegedly called for by neoliberals. Instead, privatization creates a monopoly in that service previously provided for directly by the government. A monopoly subject to state dominion lest they lose their monopoly privilege. Similarly, the removal of one restriction on voluntary economic activity, even if hundreds more are put in its place, each twice as onerous and costly as the one, are put forward as the government's excuse for deregulation. Any one of these topics are worth a video on their own, but for the sake of brevity, I will simply remark that no honest observer can examine these actions and conclude that the state implementing it is in any way lessening its exercise of illegitimate, coercive authority over a population. It's no less assault just because the person who punches you 3 times a day suddenly decides to punch you only 2 times today. Perhaps a more specific example will suffice. The 2008 financial crisis brought about a resurgence of interest in the term neoliberal as the political pseudoscience profession sought to figure out new narratives to justify the state's dominion over society after the state's dominion over society saw millions of people have their home values plummet, jobs eradicated, savings wiped out. It was just a mess. But to the proponents of the neoliberal narrative, this crisis that was clearly brought about because of the government was caused by a fixation on the dominion of market forces on the part of neoliberal politicians. Neoliberals using their rapidly growing hegemony to allow the market, instead of the government, to dictate housing policy and remove the necessary government safeguards in place to facilitate economic competition. It was just the market, you see, that forced banks to give loans to poor people who couldn't afford it. It was the market that bailed out Russia and Indonesia and created an impression among financial organizations that the government would just bail them out if they were ever in financial trouble. It was the market that fined and prosecuted banks who didn't give enough loans to poor people. It was the market that caused the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates to 1% and inflate the housing bubble in the mid-00s. It was the market, you see, that bought millions upon millions of bad loans and bad mortgages from banks that gave them the liquid capital they needed to continue to make bad loans. It was the market that caused the 2008 financial crash, even though all the narratives about the necessary safeguards that were put in place contradict themselves constantly, and that all the narratives about how it's the market's fault fall apart with even basic, cursory examination. Yeah, sure. I believe everything that these liars say. And if you watched my video explaining the truth about the 2008 financial crisis, you know as well that the housing crisis was actually an accumulation of decades of central planners and ideologues using the coercion and violence of the state to implement their grand design of housing as a right. That lessening economic restrictions were present at all, let alone a cause, is incoherent and contrary to observable reality. The neoliberal label describes contradictory phenomena and can only be justified through either cherry-picking or ignoring reality altogether. I can't say that people who don't identify as neoliberal didn't exist in the past or that they don't exist now. The Adam Smith Institute in the UK is an example, and you can find some self-proclaimed neoliberalism on r/neoliberal as well. However, the neoliberal label is applied more broadly than the relatively tiny number of self-proclaimed neoliberals would suggest it's worth, as the term describes nothing and its descriptive power is non-existent. The term is completely meaningless, and it lacks any explanatory power. This isn't a conclusion I'm alone in coming up with. A lot of discussion about neoliberalism is centered on this very controversy. In fact, a lot of academics who have researched and studied neoliberalism have come to this very conclusion, even though they remain insistent on promoting it. Neoliberalism is a slippery concept, meaning different things to different people. A veritable galaxy of things are now attached to the term neoliberalism, if not as some primary identifying marker, then at least as one descriptive property among others. Ironically, once this prescriptive understanding the legitimizing of capitalism is recognizing, the task of deciphering contemporary neoliberalism arguably becomes harder, particularly concerning efforts to understand where certain ideas and values tied to neoliberalism acquire their commonsensical power. If neoliberalism is a moving concept, then scholarship needs to be equally adept at moving with it. It is almost a cliché to claim that neoliberalism is a difficult concept to pin down. Despite the work that has been spent apparently doing just that, pinning it down, only recently, Weller and O'Neill were still compelled to ask, what is neoliberalism? The question is, what is this neoliberalism? This book abounds with definitions, a motivating spirit, a theoretical approach, an internationalized policy framework, a mobile policy knowledge, a complex of regimes, a set of practices, a cultural orientation infiltrating contemporary life, and so on. It has become a crutch, holding up weak analyses or a vague, insufficiently argued for, one-size-fits-all explanation for a diverse range of events and circumstances. Its readily made assumptions press all manner of events into a single template and avoid detailed scrutiny of the real forces and processes driving economic, cultural, and social change. The term neoliberalism refers to different types of phenomena, from abstract ideas and ideologies to categories of occurrences to sets of practices and to forms of governmentality. It is sometimes positioned as a causal force, sometimes a process, sometimes a change agent, and sometimes an effect or outcome. Believe me, there's a lot more, and this is all just from one book. The scholarly attempt to pin down neoliberalism created enough confusion that even the scholars who have dedicated their careers to studying neoliberalism admit they have no frickin' idea what neoliberalism even is. Contrast this with the anti-concept called capitalism. Now, capitalism means multiple contradictory things, but no matter if you think capitalism refers to a system of voluntary exchange or a system of private ownership of the means of production for profit, everyone generally agrees capitalism is an economic system. It is impossible to tell if neoliberalism is an economic system, a set of cultural norms, a moral system, a political philosophy, an experimentation process, what have you. This confusion makes any attempt at using the neoliberal label to describe anything an act of cognitive dissonance. In the very essays those quotes admitting the writers have no way of evaluating anything as neoliberal come from, they still insist on applying the label anyways. When your label has no parameters, it becomes unfalsifiable. There is no way to prove that something is not, or even is, neoliberal. It is clearly an anti-concept. And the idea, the audacity for people to have, that somehow neoliberal is just this hegemonic idea that is dominant in the West today makes absolutely no freaking sense. Because if we can't pin down what the hell neoliberalism actually means, how the hell can we expect politicians who are expected to implement neoliberalism supposed to even know what the hell they're implementing in the first place? The next question is then, why use it? There is a surprisingly large body of scholarly work dedicated specifically to studying a term only used, unironically, by a handful of Redditors and a think tank or two. So there is a large amount of investment in the term, way larger than neoliberalism's actual impact. So what's going on? Well, it's marginalizing. People will regard membership with their own political philosophy or party as their in-group. They may not be necessarily hostile to others, but there is a demarcation between us and not us. By attaching the neoliberal label to people one disagrees with, it not only signals to people in your group that the person being targeted is not us, but also isolates them from their groups, if the accusation is taken seriously. They can't be part of the conservative club if they're neoliberals, for example. But because neoliberalism doesn't exist, they are forced into the margins, pitting one's intellectual opponents against each other, a divide-and-conquer strategy. This is useful in electoral politics, such that one's party may exploit the confusion to their own advantage and gain control of the levers of power. However, this is not the only benefit of applying that meaningless label. Recall the argument that the status quo of the West since the 80s has been defined by neoliberalism and that it is still in power today. This narrative benefits the state by creating two snug assumptions one has to agree to believe it to be true. One, that the state can act in your interest, and two, the state is motivated by philosophy. By claiming that your rulers are part of the neoliberal club, in which you're not invited, it marginalizes them into a separate group that is unconsciously assumed to be competitive to yours, if not outright antagonistic. The state's victimization of your rights, therefore, is assumed to be a result of neoliberals just acting neoliberally. It's identical to the deep state, or swamp narratives conservatives like to use, that the problem of state antagonism can be boiled down to just a small number of bad actors, that if removed, would cause the state to start producing puppies and fluffy bunnies, marshmallows and chicken tendies. This assumes that the state has no interest or motivations, or that it creates no incentives for those acting on its behalf to think or act a certain way. This is false, as state actors have a class interest that is antagonistic to you or I, regardless of what label they use this week. One need only observe that every single political actor throughout history, without exception, always agreed that it is legitimate for a small group of ruling elites, called the government, to steal from you and restrict your activities for the interest inherent in the state to become apparent. Even if it were 100% true that Donald Trump and every US president all the way back to Ronald Reagan or hell, even George Washington, were secret agents of the Masonic Order of the neoliberal Illuminati Bilderberg Templars, groomed from birth to fight and die for the Adam Smith Institute, their interests as state actors compels them to prey on you and your rights. If they were not members of any secret societies, they would still prey on your rights. The results are the same, one way or the other. They're going to steal your money. They're going to restrict your economic activity, tell you how you can and cannot trade, where you are able to do so, and with whom, what you are required to do, who you will go to war with. All of these aggressions against your bodily autonomy, and they want us to be worried about whether or not some income tax rates shift 2 or 3 percentage points? Come on, you're not stupid, dear viewer. But everything I said also dispels the myth that the government operates philosophically for reasons I just described. The neoliberalism narrative implies the state is an inert tool whose actions are just a mirror reflection of the politician's legislative and philosophical agenda. It distracts from what the state actually is, which is a relationship in which victims are forced to pay for their own oppression, which creates incentives that drive both victims and aggressors to act and behave in certain ways. The neoliberal narrative is put forward by Marxists and fascists quite frequently, but is by no means exclusive to them. But it's really only useful to statists. It's used to create a philosophy to contrast the speaker against, to appeal to tribalism by directing your ire against a mutual enemy to manipulate you into allying with people who do not have your best interests at heart. But neoliberalism describes nothing. According to the scholars dedicated to studying it, they're not even sure it's a philosophy at all. It did exist at one point, but we already have a term for that philosophy: social democrats. We also have a term to describe pro-market state skeptic statists, classical liberals. Those that peddle in the term peddle in ignorance. I said earlier that there are people who do unironically describe themselves as neoliberal. However, since it is impossible to demarcate what neoliberalism means, let alone what it even is, no self-proclaimed neoliberal can explain their neoliberal ideas coherently. Neoliberalism doesn't exist. It is nothing. And those that put forward the narrative are either ignorant or are trying to deceive you. And I'm actually curious to those who do peddle this narrative. Which one is it? The neoliberal term is an active impediment to understanding and communication. If you've watched this far into the video, now you have a better understanding of the term. That is to say, there is nothing to understand about neoliberalism. It is non-understandable. But at least now, you know why. So next time you hear the term used, ask them what neoliberalism means. Have them provide you examples, and you will find contradictions in their stated definitions very quickly. Questions? Comments? Critique? How often do you hear the term neoliberalism thrown around? Do you even hear it at all? Leave a comment below. Support me on Patreon. Like, share, and subscribe to become a heretic today.